If you've been playing card games for a long time like I have, then you're probably familiar with what a card designed to be a top end is and why it's important for TCGs. If you're new to TCGs and just jumping in because your favorite IP just got one, let me explain. A top end card or strategy is designed to be a finisher. Think about a champion's ultimate in Summoner's Rift or Teamfight Tactics translated to cardboard. Top ends are really important for a number of reasons. They give a deck something to work towards, otherwise known as a payoff, and they help make sure that games can actually end in a timely manner, which is good for logistical reasons. The trick to making good top-end cards is balance. You don't want them to be too strong or too weak, and you especially don't want players to feel like they have no agency when a top-end card is played. Riftbound Origins contains some really strong top-end cards, and in today's video, I want to talk about how they're shaping the format, how to beat them, and what they could mean for the future of the game. But first, don't forget to subscribe, like, and hype the video, and let's get right into it talking about everyone's favorite card, Dazzling Aurora. At this point, Dazzling Aurora is the poster boy for top-end finisher cards in Riftbound, and the funny part is, it doesn't end the game as soon as it's played, but what Dazzling Aurora does is it helps the player who cast it gather a critical mass of units that pretty much just outright win the game once you get to a certain amount of might that your opponent just can't deal with. There's only so much removal they're going to have access to, so many units they can ram into your units as a Dazzling Aurora player, and they're eventually just going to get outvalued and out-resourced. So Dazzling Aurora really plays to the basics and fundamentals of any card game in its infancy, which is, again, value, resources, and overall stats. Dazzling Aurora just kind of takes that concept and breaks it in half, to be honest. What's also funny about Dazzling Aurora is that it hasn't been winning tournaments out of the Chinese regional season with 4 regionals and 1 national tournament. It only won 1 tournament and wasn't really included in the top 8 that much in any of the other events. So a lot of Riftbound players out there are probably wondering, and rightfully so, why are we still talking about Dazzling Aurora? Why are people still complaining about it? And why do people dislike it so much when it's not even doing all that well? And I'll give you the reason. The reason is Dazzling Aurora shapes the format in such a way where you have to be able to build decks to beat it. And if you're not, you're going to just absolutely get run over by a Dazzling Aurora strategy. Let me explain. Most Kai'Sa and Master Yi builds have the aggressive capabilities or the right number of low-cost units to punish Dazzling Aurora decks for taking too long to set up. Besides that, decks like Master Yi also have good tools like Sabotage in order to stifle Dazzling Aurora strategies. And Kai'Sa is so fast and efficient that it can get to 6 points so quickly, so just one turn of resolving Dazzling Aurora, putting a big unit in a battlefield, isn't enough to stop Kai'Sa when it can just play Thousand Tail Watcher, take that battlefield back, and win the game. Dazzling Aurora does take multiple turns to really get the most value out of the card and ultimately snowball games from there. However, there are some circumstances where the card does showcase just how strong it is and how oppressive it can be, like when a green-orange Yi or Lee Sin deck is able to ramp super hard in the first 2 turns and then play Dazzling Aurora on its 3rd turn. Almost no deck in the game can really contest a turn 3 Dazzling Aurora, and there's the fact that Dazzling Aurora, just by existing, does gatekeep certain strategies out of the format. For example, if you look at a card like Wraith of Echoes, this is a card that I think is really, really cool, but unfortunately can't exist in the current competitive environment of Riftbound because games just aren't slow enough for you to really get the maximum value out of this card. I would love, for example, to play Wraith of Echoes in a Victor deck where all my dead tokens turn into draws and I can slowly amass some sort of value, but that value just isn't as strong as the value that Dazzling Aurora provides because it puts huge units right onto the battlefield. So if you take a Victor deck playing a Wraith of Echoes sort of slow build-up strategy, maybe a bit more control-oriented, and you take a Dazzling Aurora ramp build, that Dazzling Aurora is going to snowball way faster than my Wraith of Echoes Victor ever could. There are, of course, other nuances as to why that particular type of Victor deck wouldn't work, like, for example, removal in the game just being really, really strong, so Wraith of Echoes probably isn't going to survive all that well. But on the flip side, Victor has access to one of the best gear removal cards in the form of Salvage, So that's a point in Victor's favor. And that walks us into how do you beat Dazzling Aurora. That's going to be mainly through either being super aggressive, like a Victor deck can do, like the properly built versions of Kaisa and Master Yi can do by playing the proper number of low-cost units, maybe playing battlefields like Arena's Greatest, but also by playing gear removal cards. Now, gear removal is not the easiest to come by for certain colors. For example, Kaisa, for as strong as it is, doesn't really have good or efficient gear removal in either of its colors. Some Kaisa builds opt to sideboard Thermo Beam in efforts to kill Dazzling Aurora, but it's not really efficient at doing so, and most Kaisa builds honestly just forego gear removal altogether and try to just go the aggro route, killing Dazzling Aurora players as fast as possible. As for the future of the game, I think Dazzling Aurora is going to make designing units going forward just a little bit tricky, because the better high cost units get, the better Dazzling Aurora strategies become. For example, a lot of Dazzling Aurora builds right now that are facing those sort of aggressive decks that get to 6 points very quickly, they rely on flipping Deadbloom Predator off the top of their deck, and if they can do so successfully, sometimes that's all the Dazzling Aurora player needs to kind of crawl back into the game, reestablish control of the battlefields, and win from there. If you print more and more units that have similar effects to Deadbloom Predator that either get into a battlefield immediately or maybe board wipe immediately, that is going to make Dazzling Aurora decks much stronger. You also have to be careful about the types of ramp you print in future sets. Cards like Find Your Center are very, very cool, and I really appreciate how they don't have to be played in purely dedicated ramp decks like Aurora. You can also easily play Find Your Center justifiably in a mid-range version of Master Yi, but with the more efficient and powerful ramp cards you print, again, Dazzling Aurora is only going to get stronger. And I think the main problem for future sets that Dazzling Aurora presents is that Dazzling Aurora is the cap of like the slowest thing you could be doing in this game. Again, that unfortunate Wraith of Echoes Victor strategy is just too slow when something like Dazzling Aurora exists in the format. And I'm not saying or calling for Dazzling Aurora to be banned. I don't think it's that much of a big deal right now, again, because it's not performing at the level of something that is potentially ban worthy. I just think there's an interesting discussion to be had about design philosophy when it comes to cards like this, as well as potentially some unfun game experiences when the Aurora player hits a turn 3 Aurora. There's very little agency that the opponent really has in that situation. But on the flip side, if you just don't draw Dazzling Aurora, which is not the most unlikely because Riftbound isn't the most consistent game out there, it's going to lead to bad play experiences either way. And that's pretty much why Dazzling Aurora is the poster boy for this type of conversation. And it leads me into the next card, which is Time Warp in blue. Now, Time Warp is funny because this was a card that's seen quite a bit of play ever since the first Chinese regional. This card was sideboarded or mainboarded in some cases in many blue decks between a lot of builds of Kaisa, between Ari. The first top 8 Ari build was actually a fully dedicated Time Warp turn skip variant. Even some variants of Teemo can play this card effectively. And what Time Warp essentially does, I mean, I guess first what it literally does is skip your opponent's turn and take you into your next turn. And in Riftbound, that has a lot of implications because of the battlefield and specifically holding mechanics. When you skip your turn with units at your battlefields, you immediately score points because you go into your next turn, your units have survived, and that is considered a hold. So Time Warp, in a lot of cases, can lead to uninteractive win conditions where, again, your opponent has very little agency in trying to stop that from happening. Now, don't get me wrong, Time Warp is not an unbeatable card. Firstly, there's the problem of the cost of the card. It is a very, very expensive card, costing you 10 energy and 4 power when the game caps out at 12 energy. The blue player using this card does have to be in a winning position to really get the most mileage out of Time Warp. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a win more card, because casting Time Warp can win you games you otherwise may not have won. For example, maybe the game is neck and neck and you've just gotten your 2 very small, very easily removable units into battlefields, and you know if you go back to your opponent's next turn, they're going to be able to conquer both battlefields, go from 6 to 8, and win the game. But if you cast Time Warp, you skip that problem, skip your opponent's next turn, get those 2 hold points, problem solved. It won you a game that you otherwise would not have won. It's also worth mentioning that if you cast Time Warp specifically on 12 energy, yes, you are going to pay 4 power, but going into your next turn, you're going to charge 2 new runes, putting you back to 10 energy, and then giving you the opportunity to cast back-to-back Time Warps, which feels even worse for the opponent having to face down a Time Warp strategy. That can technically take you directly from 4 to 8 points if everything goes right for you. Now, once again, the card's not unbeatable. We see this card in and out of various blue decks. It's not a mainstay staple by any means. How do you go about beating Time Warp? Of course, there is the color green, which is the only color that has access to actually counter spells. That's one way to do it. You've got Sabotage in orange that can actually pick the Time Warp out of the opponent's hand. That's a very strong thing for our non-green orange decks to have access to. But the main way to do it, with your draws and RNG permitting, is just to keep your blue opponent out of the battlefields, out of those easy hold situations, not let them score as frequently and as easily. And that, of course, is easier said than done. Once again, it depends on your draws, depends on the matchup, depends on your experience with Riftbound. So that is a little bit unfortunate as well. Time Warp can sort of serve as a noob stomper and really make people who are new to Riftbound have a somewhat frustrating experience when they're still trying to learn the game, and then their opponent all of a sudden drops a Time Warp on the board. They read that card and they say to themselves, what? Why did I sign up for this locals? This card skips my turn in set 1. That's kind of a crazy thing to think about, to be honest. The fact that a card in set 1 says skip your opponent's turn. And to be honest, there's 2 cards in set 1 that do that. There's also a unit version of Echo that practically does the same thing. Once again, it's not a problematic card, but it can lead to somewhat unfun game experiences, which, you know, kind of makes it an interesting design choice for set 1. These are cards that, once again, feel like set 4, set 5 cards. I did make a video talking about things like that about a month or so ago. Just so interesting to see that these types of powerful card game effects, that if you've been around card games for a long time, you know just how strong skipping your opponent's turn is. It's interesting to see that that was something that was released in set 1 of the game, and is only going to get better as blue strategies get better. Now, in yellow, there's 2 types of cards that serve as top end for different strategies. The first one is Grand Stratagem. This one is well known about at this point. This is basically Victor's win condition when you're going for a super wide token spam. Grand Stratagem is pretty akin to Time Warp in that it can help you win games that you had no business winning. And that's not, again, automatically a bad thing. It doesn't mean the card shouldn't have been printed, but it is a very powerful board-wide buff, especially in, again, a deck like Victor, where you're putting out a ton of 1 might recruit tokens, and if you have 4 or 5 of those, that instantly becomes like 20 or so might that you're going to be able to overcome and take the game with. Now, I guess I should say these cards are only as good as the end game scenario is easy to set up, right? Once again, going to the Time Warp example, the card is only as good as, you know, if your opponent's allowing you to really maintain control of battlefields, if you're scoring easily, if your opponent knows what they're doing in Riftbound, or just has a lot of removal to take your units out of those battlefields, Time Warp's going to be a lot less effective. Same thing with Grand Stratagem. If your opponent kind of knows what they're doing, or just has the capability to deal with a lot of your tokens, not really let you get into battlefields, because your token strategy is going to rely on a lot of small units, and if you're not able to bully your opponent out of battlefields, how are you going to get to 6 points to actually win the game with Grand Stratagem, right? That's actually one way you can beat Grand Stratagem, is by putting a whole lot of pressure on Victor early, because both playing against and playing as Victor, I've noticed a lot of scenarios where I've been like, wow, I am down 2 points. If I let my opponent score twice on the next turn, they win the game. I need to get in these battlefields, and I might have to use my Grand Stratagem defensively to try and just not lose the game, let alone win the game. I don't know what I'm going to do if I actually get to 6 points, because this is the 1 copy of Grand Stratagem I have, and we're going to just kind of pray to Aurelion Sol or whoever is listening out there. The other yellow card that's picking up a lot of popularity as of late, and is honestly the reason I wanted to make this video, is Divine Judgment. I think when the set was first revealed, people looked at Divine Judgment and didn't really take it too seriously. The card seemed more of like a multiplayer card, and it wouldn't be so good in 1v1 competitive. And to be honest, turns out that's not really the case, because when you're casting Divine Judgment, yes, you are setting yourself back, but you're also setting your opponent back heavily. And this is the first card we see in this type of archetype of top-end finisher cards that actually helps players come back from losing positions. You can be losing on the board, you can be losing in runes, you can be losing in hand size, you can be losing in all 3 of those, and if you cast Divine Judgment, you are going to equalize the board and potentially mount a comeback from that. And that's a pretty interesting way to design a card, to be honest. Whether you play good old Summoner's Rift or TFT or other card games, generally comeback mechanics are pretty hard to build into the game. A lot of times players who either have a good early start, assuming you equalize skill level, are going to come out ahead and usually win the game. But having good comeback mechanics is a really fun thing for players because, again, it gives you agency. It gives you the feeling that you can potentially win this game. It doesn't just come down to the die roll. It doesn't just come down to who bricked in their opening hand. There are cards that actually help me crawl back into a game. And again, the key there is balancing them. I don't feel like Divine Judgment is overly oppressive. However, it does seem to be very, very strong in Set because Set naturally plays from a very small resource pool. You're constantly recycling runes to both play your units and protect them with your legend ability. So if you can get to a decent state on the board, maybe get in control of the battlefield, maybe hide a card or two to really get value out of Divine Judgment, and then you cast it, set your opponent down to low runes, low hand, low battlefield presence as well. Now they're playing in your world, and now you're going to look a lot more likely to win the game. Again, I do think this is a very interesting card, probably the card I like most from this list, because again, it's not a sort of like end all be all top end that is going to win you the game almost 99% of the time that you cast it. Instead, it's got that comeback capability, which I do think is very, very cool. Now, not all colors really have cards like this. For example, I couldn't find a card in purple that I thought really fit the bill for this video. However, there's a card in red that hasn't been talked about a lot yet, but I do think can fill this purpose. Now, red is more of an aggressive color, so it wouldn't really make sense to have a super strong top end like I win the game button, but there is a card called Brynrear Thundersong that can set up situations where you are going to be very, very likely to win the game if his effect goes off. Brynrear Thundersong says that when he is played, your opponent cannot activate cards. That means your opponent can't use actions or reactions to interrupt your units attacking. They can't do anything for the most part, and that can set up uninteractive win conditions, whether it's some sort of like Vi Ride the Wind combo or just pushing with your Dravens and your Darius Trifarians with huge might, and your opponent's not going to be able to rely on spells or battle tricks to get out of those tricky situations. Unlike the other cards in this video, Brynrear has the advantage of being a unit, and there aren't really many or kind of any things in the game practically that can stop a unit's ability from resolving once it's played. There's no sabotage for it, there's no win wall or defy for it. This thing is going to resolve when it's played. However, it does also require you to be in a winning position or a position where you can steal a game. So it's not really going to help you come back from behind like Divine Judgment is. It's more like Time Warp or Grand Stratagem, where it could be that final piece you need to win a game, or it can kind of steal you a game that you weren't really meant to win. This card has seen side deck play in red decks from time to time, and it's not a perfect card in red. I don't expect it to be a mainstay staple by the end of this format or anything like that, because the card is relatively highly costed for a red card, as it should be. If it's going to completely shut off your opponent's ability to interact, it should be one of the highest costed, reasonably played cards. Out of all the cards on this list, though, I think Thundersong is probably the one we have to watch out for the most, just because, again, it is on the lower cost of all the other cards in this video. It's a unit, so there are far less answers to the card, at least as of right now. I'm sure in the future we will get cards that can counter unit abilities and prevent them from going off. That's going to be a really big deal when it comes to dealing with a card like Thundersong, but the capabilities are there. It's looking like it could be very, very strong given the right format. And overall, what's interesting is it seems like set one was kind of designed around these cards. Like, these are the top end, most high costed game winning things you could be doing. How do we build cards? How do we design decks to play underneath these limiters in terms of, you know, aggression? And aggro in this game is also very interesting, maybe deserving a video of its own, but you're kind of limited with how aggressive you can be in this game because you can only score each battlefield up to twice per turn. So that means to get to 8 points, that's going to take you a minimum of 4 turns, not accounting for any shenanigans where you score some points on your opponent's turn, which is rare, but possible. So yeah, that's what I got for this video, guys. Just want to talk about the kind of strongest top end cards, some implications, some counters, some things that I was thinking about. Of course, I want to know in the comments below what you think about these types of cards. Do you think they should have been released in set 1? Do you think they're generally perfectly fine? Once again, I want to say this is not a ban list video. I do err on the side of these cards pretty much being perfectly fine because, again, they're not tier 0 in any capacity or overtaking the format. They just kind of put a goalpost and say, hey, your deck, if you want to play a slow, controlled, methodical deck, it can't be slower than these cards allow, which I think is interesting. But the bottom line is, I've been loving Riftbound, and I want to know in the comments below, how have you been enjoying the game now that it is physically released? Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.